economic growth. Matter of fact, when you think about growth in terms of theory, and when you think about growth in general as an economist, you do not actually concentrate on GMP. You concentrate on utility. And there is abundant research trying to figure out if and what makes people's life better. So your model or your theorizing about growth is all about people happiness. This has allowed research to write models in which there is pollution, in which there is fatigue, gesture, and a variety of other things. Now, what happened to the camera? Show what? Change camera and realize. You guys know why the camera is not showing me, but it's actually showing. Okay, now it's showing. Oh, this room has the cameras that work apparently, contrary to the other one. Big illusion. It's that one, but it's showing us your screen. It's pointed on your screen. It's fascinating. Okay. Let's move it away. Don't worry. Now it's got my face and only my face. Hello? Huh? No, don't worry. No, it's totally crazy. It's pointed to that and this. So it doesn't show me, it doesn't show anything. It shows your PC. Huh? Just a little bit. Just a little bit. Okay. So the theory of economic growth, in terms of theory, is about utility. And as you know, there is a gigantic debate, way out of proportion, about the fact that GMP is happiness or not. GMP is not happiness. Happiness, if it is of this world, it's a subjective thing. Economists have nothing to say about happiness. Absolutely nothing. I can tell you about my happiness or lack of it, but that's not very interesting in an economic class. It may be interesting when I've been readers, lots of them, but not in class. Point is that when we talk about growth, we talk about utilities. We talk about aggregate or some form of people desire. Is GMP a good measure of growth? Maybe not. Maybe yes. One thing we know, which sociologists and other social psychologists have been doing it extensively for the last, I would say 40, 50 years, which is going around the world and asking people of different social extraction, different races, different ethnic groups, different languages, how happy they are or satisfied they are about their life, how realized they think they are, if their life got better, their life got worse, all this kind of stuff, and what their income was. And one thing pops up, like it or not, the correlation between any measure of individual well-being and income, very high, 0.9, 0.95, very high. One of those correlations that you wish you had for other variables that you like to forecast, because with the correlation like that, you can't go wrong, right? Another second piece of evidence, which I find overwhelmingly clear, is the following. I have seen, unfortunately, I don't know, but I've seen millions of people over time moving from places where there was low GMP, superior technology, poverty, war, desperation, famine, to places where they had a chance of making a life. And I've seen people dying. We're witnessing these days. And so maybe GMP is not happiness, but it helps. right? That's all I can say. And it looks like that in order to help, people are willing to play incredibly nasty. Okay. So that's all I have to say about that. After which we can certainly debate for a long time what are proper ways of computing what's good for humans, what's bad for humans. But let's say that it doesn't look like being able to produce useful things in a not brutal way, without much fatigue, living in decent setting, working decently is a bad thing for most humans. Most humans seem to like it. There might be some humans that don't, which is fine. The world is in fact full of nasty places. In case you like to live alone in a nasty environment, I'm sure the Sahara Desert is pretty empty. So what's GNP? That's for national income accounting, but when we talk about growth, this is classical graph. That's GDP per capita in real terms for the US. Goes up per capita. Total GDP has obviously grown a lot more. This starts in 1948, ends in 2020. Population of the United States is probably more than tripled during this period. US was there over 100 million people right after World War II. It's now about 30 million. So this was expressed in nominal terms, a much bigger growth. This is per capita, and it's normalized in dollars of 2012, so dollars of purchasing power of about 10 years ago. It's almost 60,000. Now remember, this is GDP. And here, one important thing is the word gross. This doesn't mean, to avoid this mistake that uninformed people make, this doesn't mean that every American has 60,000 bucks to spend every year for sale. That would be too nice. Okay? The actual income that you put in your pocket and you can use, you as a single citizen, it's a lot smaller. Why? Because GDP, first of all, is G. So it contains all the amount you produce in 1 year, but you then use to replace capital goods that gets depleted, so-called depreciation. They used to be about 6-7%. It's now well above 10. Why? Because some of the instruments that are very efficient that we use, such as those we're using right now, depreciate a lot faster. Okay? You got to take away a good 12%. Then there is a portion of that stuff so that gives you net national income or net domestic product. I'm sure everybody knows the difference between domestic and national, right? It's subtle discussion of difference that for some countries is very relevant, say Japan, United States too, right? Because domestic computes what's produced in the land. And it doesn't matter who the owner of the factors of production. Vice versa, national measures what's produced by citizens of the land, even if produced abroad. The part that pertains to income of citizens of the land and corporations is part of national of GDP. So this is GDP. So this is what produced in the land, in the 50 states of the United States. Let me show other things just to give you an idea. GDP and consumption move very close. So the number changed. This is 44,000. So that tells you that where we would go eventually from 60, we would go down to about 40,000. Okay, per capita. These are the same values, but it's Japan, and it starts later. And you see it grows so faster for a period. Now it slowed down. We'll talk. I'll go back to this graph. This is China. Numbers are smaller again. You see, this is 10,000. These are expressed all in the same dollars. Okay, so it's 10,000. Matter of fact, hasn't moved. And you see there is clear acceleration and slowdown. Very low value for China in the 70s and early 80s before. Okay, let's go back here and remember a bit how to go from this number to the idea of money in the pocket. So once we've taken away depreciation, we have also to start breaking up things. Yes, once you take away depreciation, this should correspond to the net income of the two factors. Labor, all kind of labor, everything we attribute to labor. Okay? The capital, everything we attribute to capital. That includes interest payment, that includes rents, that includes return on dwellings, that includes also a piece of fictional output in the sense that it's not corresponding to monetary transaction, because we impute income to your house, to your house. So if my house, I live in a house that is my property. I don't pay income. Oh, sorry, I don't pay rent for the house to myself. But the system of national account says, oh, there is a house there. Somebody's living in it. That is creating value by the fact of being used, which we impute. So you take a bunch of parameters, you look at what rents are per square meter or per square foot, even though it's United States, they use units of accounting, among them feet, yards, miles, gallons, ounces, cups, and God knows what. Okay? And they say, okay, for such and such house, the imputed value is X. That gets added to national. No money in my pocket, but it's because GMP is not, or GDP, PIL in Italian, you're not trying to compute actual monetary payment. That's computed, but separate. You're trying to compute the value expressed in a certain unit of account of whatever people produce in 1 year, okay, in the country, right? So you have to take that away. And that goes to capitalism, which is, for example, for those of you that are fan of Thomas Piketty, one of the great tricks that Thomas has used to make capital income go through the roof in the 90s and 2000s. Because the value of a house, in many places of the United States, doubled, tripled in nominal terms in the house. And consequently, the imputed value also doubled and tripled. And that became capitalism. So you had both an increasing wealth, capital wealth. Your house was worth 300,000 in 1985 and 700,000 in 2008, then you were $400,000 richer. That was capital. Everybody is a little capitalist in owning a house. So that increased the share of income going to house, and therefore to capital. Okay. You have to take that away if you want to compute what people put in the pocket. Then there are two other components that you have to control. One is not so large, it's large, but not so large, and it is retained earnings. That goes to wealth. It doesn't go to necessarily to income. Retained earning means a corporation that has shares, makes profits, distributed some of them in form of dividends, and other were retained for investment. So that increases your wealth. It's part of national income that year because it's profits coming from production of that year, but it's not money in the pocket. Okay, let's oscillate. There are years in which it's large, years in which it's smaller. It depends often on tax provisions. Large component is tax. So think, for example, if you're doing this for a country you know better, right? Because you're late, otherwise, well, you can do it in the United States as well, so you get an idea what taxation. Say, for example, I just discovered that the University of Venice, if I don't keep presenting it, a stupid certificate that the United States, they trust me, right? To declare that I have fiscal residence in the state, they take my signature. They don't want certificate. And United Italy, the state doesn't trust me. The criminal state, unless you prove the opposite. The way, no, I'm not kidding. Borbonic laws that run this country. First of all, you're a criminal. Then, if you prove you're not a criminal, temporarily, I don't treat you as a criminal. You're a criminal. You have to prove with a certificate that you're not a tax. And you have to do it every year. You're getting sick and tired of this. Become a citizen and not a criminal. So I checked what the Italian state would tax the reimbursement that the University of Venice gives me for teaching. Very interesting. They would tax 65% of it. In case I don't teach next year, you may know what. Okay. 65%. Just a neat, nice 65%. Oh. Okay, let's move on. It's at almost 66%, I should say. So that old big chunk gets taken away. True. Part of it, all of it, goes to pay. Yeah, it becomes very tricky. It becomes extremely. What happens with that 66% they take care of? 50% in Italy, about 32, 33% on average in the United States. It becomes tax revenues of a large entity called the public sector, not just the state. Municipalities, regions, in the United States, the states, the counties, lots of stuff. The school district, let's call it the public sector. What does the public sector do with that? The public sector, let's assume there's no deficit. The public sector, that every dollar that goes in gets spent, and vice versa, there are no dollars spent that don't come in taxation, from some form of taxation. Okay? It's a balanced budget year by year. Governments use their money in two forms. They buy goods and services. That is, they pay salaries and they buy electricity stuff. That's G in the classical way of writing national income accounting that you're all familiar with. There's some private consumption, C, private investment, G, I, E, in Italian, I in English, and G, public expenditure. Another chunk, in fact, by far the largest chunk, for example, in this country, is a transfer. That is, it becomes pocket income or money income of people that generated no income. Pensioners and the small minority that lives on welfare. Do you understand how it works? But never forget that the budget of IMPS, for example, in this country, is about 450 billion out of a national income of GDP of 1,600. So it's almost a quarter, more than a quarter, almost a third. Okay? The way that money goes there is by being produced, taken away in the form of social security contribution, and in fact, in the case of Italy, taxes as well, because the social security contribution are not even remotely covered in expenditures. Think about 100 billion that goes in for general taxation. I don't remember the numbers exactly, so go and check. That goes to a particular agency of the state called IMPS, I say the Social Security Administration, and that is sent out as transfer payment to pensioners and people on welfare, so on, employed people, handicapped, and so on. Okay. Those are transfer. They don't enter G. They don't enter G. And here one says, oh, if they don't enter G, where are they? Well, they're actually in the part of C and I that contains taxation. The national income account is strict. You've got to be looking at it carefully. Because in fact, you always have to remember that it's always true. This, once you take away depreciation, forget depreciation, take away. Once you take away depreciation, C plus I plus G, I'm doing a closed economy, plus X minus M, but that's the closed economy. X is export, M is import, is equal to W plus capital income. So gross labor income plus gross capital income, net and depreciation. And those incomes contain all the taxation. Okay. All right. Also, this number here that you see does not mean that the average American has actually purchased consumption good for about $42,000 last year. This big drop, by the way, closing down virus. Okay, you see how big it is compared to the gigantic recession of 2000. This vertical gray line are MBR recession. Sometimes you don't see the recession. You see, this recession, you don't see it's a flat. This recession is a small, it's a flat. This is a recession, it's a little bit of a recession. This is flat. This is a recession. This is a serious recession. This is flat. This is a serious recession. This actually is growth. We always joke on this recession. This is the 2000 recession. The joke is, that's not a recession. People would just postpone working for a while because they wanted to watch the first Iraq war on TV. Was the joke used to go around 21 years ago when people said, oh, we are in a recession. You said, what do you mean? Which recession? I see no recession. The joke was, well, MBR that we're just watching. National Bureau of Economic Research. The private research institution, which I'm most part, and it just became tradition. They were the Burns and Mitchell that are the founders of this organization. It includes a lot of universities, economics department things. We are the first in the early 20th century to start measuring carefully, using national income accounting to measure carefully what was going on to the overall economy of the country, unemployment, how many people are working, hours work, this kind of things, capacity utilization. And so they started to date recession. Very funny, it's a bit funny because there is a committee of economists that like to follow that, the meet, and they look at a bunch of indicators. And they say, the country is in a recession. The country is not in a recession. Things like that. So, literally the MBR has called a recession. But anyhow, a true recession, you see, it's something like this. Okay? When you see GNP going down for real and unemployment going up for real, then there is a recession. And the other stuff depends. Okay? What it shows is that growth is not constant at all, not even in trend. It oscillates. There are spurs, there are periods, there are expansion that are very long. You see why the 60s are seen by everybody as a bit of a myth? See, these recessions were very mild. Income grew after the war. Then there is this long expansion. This is not you see, it's bad. So the expansion started basically in 1960 and ends here in 1974, 75. This is the first oil shock. This is a serious business, right? Oil shock, Vietnam War, end of Vietnam War, big inflation, US exiting the gold standard, lots of stuff. Okay, so this is the first. So people here were coming out from a period of 13 years of very good growth, okay, which consumption goes from about 10,000 to 17. We're not unhappy. Consumption going up about 70-80%, right? Almost double. So you see why. And then there is this period of turmoil. Then there is growth again. Not have time. One difference between the growth long period of growth here and here is that it's less uniformly distributed, less equal, it's more unequal. So it creates a different reaction. So that's and you see the same. Look at here, consumption expansion is very strong, right, all the way to 1990, and you see how it goes, grows, but a lot slower. Okay. Sorry, that was Japan. This is Japan. Yeah, so this is Japan, very, very fast growth. Then there is the period of when Japan gets into a crisis, and then it goes a lot slower. But it grows. I haven't put the one for Italy. We'll look for it. I don't want to. And this is China. It looks almost exponential, but if you look carefully, you see it slowing down. So what is in fact that we look at this? If you take the very long run perspective, they all look alike. Those that grow. It's a bit like the famous Tolstoy incipit of the Anna Karenina. Right? All happy families are happy in roughly the same way. And it's that the unhappy one of all their particular regions. What does it mean? When I look at economies that grow in the long run, not for brief period, but for 10, 20, 30-year century, the patterns are extremely similar, depending on which stage they are when they start. The patterns are all very similar. Phase in which you build up manufacturing, you build your energy sources. If you're England, you start looking at the 18th century, you don't have electric power, your energy source is coal, because that's what's available, so you mine and build coal. If instead you are China, then please. No. Nothing. Inada is put Inada brought down something on the boundary of a function. No. Maybe it's some joke, but I don't think no. So the process of growth is very similar. Now, some have done it very fast, some have done it much more slowly, and it's obvious. I don't know why there is such a big debate of why China is growing so fast, or why countries that come to industrialization later then grow much faster than others. Because copying is a lot easier than Jesus. That's not so difficult, right? Right. There is a debate, and in fact, the debate should be why China, why India is not. And if you look at the policies, you figure out why. We'll get to that. But those that grow, they all grow the same. And it's quite apparent that if you come very late in the process, you skip a number of steps. The British had to figure out the steam engine, had to figure out the spinning technique, had to figure out the factory system. You may like it or not, but they had to figure it out. And they had to build it and then destroy and replace it with a better one, and then destroy and replace with a better one, and so on. And by the time they learned to produce electric energy and use it in machinery, they had to redo the machinery, they had to make it more efficient, they had to find other ways to make produce electric energy, and so on. Whereas the Italians that came about 150 years later could skip a few steps. The Italians did not have to set up steam engine a la Boldrin and Watt and then say, oh, let's change it, because it looks like they're a better steam engine. No, Italians, when they started industrializing 1850, 60, 70, the factories here in the Northwest, they set up the steam engine of the time. which was a lot more powerful and efficient than the one in England, exactly almost a century before, because Boldrin wrote the first patent was 1775. So that's quite a and so on, right? Depending on sector. So if somebody now builds an hospital where there was no hospital before, well, that will not start by saying, "Oh, let's do a little bit of magic without anesthesia." You know, like we were in hospital in 1850. After all, an hospital without anesthesia, but the 1850 technology is better than no hospital at all. No, I mean, probably start out with the best machinery that you can afford. So this, I don't much understand this debate, the funny debate. Point is that they all look alike in that sense. And they all slow down eventually. They all slow down. We'll think a bit about it. There is a debate of why they are slow down. Next class, I will spend some time debating. I have my own view, but there are other views that we should think about. Not necessarily. They will talk about convergence too. They all slow down. Convergence, no convergence, no. And they all depend on the fact that you invest in new technology. Not just that you invest, but that you invest in new technology. Okay? Remember, the growth, we said it many times in this class, growth was a known topic for economics. So from the historic point of view, people start talking about growth only in the second half of the 20th century. Seriously. You already said that, but let me repeat. But what I'm going to do today, probably for a good part of what's left, is talk about the handicap that having spent 200 years thinking about growth without growth has created on economics as an analytic. If my phrase is clear. So what I'm going to do, after observing that the first person, I already said it, I think, last time or two classes ago, the first guy that talked explicitly and clearly about growth, economic development, was Chopin. That was 1911, 110 years. Before, there was no clear discussion. There was reference here and there. There was recognition that you were living better and better. There was even admiration. There was the wealthful nation. But there was no systematic thing. And in particular, there was no effort or attempt to try to model a system that grows always. And then that debate was abandoned. We also mentioned why: the Great Depression, the war. You don't think about growth and innovation, and the bigger is the only innovation is to build weapons. And, millions of unemployed people was sour. You actually think, oh my God, game is over. And this is going to be the end. And then people resumed thinking about growth in the 50s, 70 years ago. They're not in the 40s. So the history of the theory of growth, mention Chopin, then you jump 50 years and you start from the 1950s and from there on. And so remember, I already said stationary state was the basis. All the economic analysis of the classic is in stationary state. They managed to understand that there is the economic system is circular. Things go in, then they come out, and then they go in again, then they come out, then they go in again. There might be a surplus in the sense that what comes out is bigger than what goes in. But at the end, there is this view of Malthus, either Malthusian region or if Marxian region. Marx also is a steady state guy. In that he calls the crisis of capitalism means that there is no growth. That eventually stock of capital that you have to build up has become so large that the best you can do even if you exploit the workers, which means you pay the workers the least, but you can pay them and have them work, what you produce is only enough to replace the capital. So in our GDP, Marx's view is GDP is big, NDP is small, because most of it is depreciation. Okay? He got it wrong. It didn't work that way. GDP didn't become 6 times NDP. It became 12% bigger, but that's it. Okay? That was steady state. It's a very simple way of expressing steady state. Steady state economy is an economy in which output goes into consumption investment in every. And that's the second key condition. The stock of productive capacity is constant. Therefore, tomorrow's stock of productive capacity, K, is equal to today's stock of productive capacity, K, minus the depreciated part, which is a percentage, we call it M, but whatever, I just want to use a simple letter I have on the keyboard, plus gross investment. Obviously, if this is equal to this, then this has to be equal to M times K, right? So investment goes purely to replace depreciation. That's a steady state. Now, in this class, we mentioned briefly activity analysis and the possibility of representing an economic system in a much more informative way than this. This is just aggregate numbers in euros, lira, yen, dollars of a given year. We can do the same thing. Let's imagine that these are vectors, long vectors. So why just a long vector? It's a column of 6,250,000 entries. Banana, t-shirt, mask, so you don't get polluted and things like that. Right? And some of the entries in C will be 0 if they're not a consumption good. Some of the entries in I will be 0 if that's not an investment. You can write it that way. And so you can write in that way K as well. K is a long list of machinery and tools and things, right? And some of them will depreciate instantaneously. So M will be 100%. Some will not depreciate at all, maybe, or very slowly. Some will be replaced, some will be not, and so on. So you can write it equal to that, right? And it's good to imagine it that way. Try to use your imagination. Think of steady state as that. This big, long list of things. Why it's important to think it that way? Because in that way you eliminate technological change. Right? Because if it is really the same good, and it's really always the same vector of goods, because if it is steady state, then this vector here, and this vector here, and this vector here have the same components. So there is no new good. Okay? Then there is really no technological change. If absolutely all the goods that are being produced this year are identical to those that were produced last year, there's nothing new and nothing old. I don't throw away any. Because while I am in the process of, say, replacing an old laptop with a new laptop with a faster processor, I'm still, right, having technological change, de facto. I am replacing old productive capacity with better new productive capacity. That's the adoption. So that has to be completed too. The good that there are good that we use and produce and consume. They don't change either in the positive or in the negative. You neither add nor subtract. And that's a good state. That's a true stationary state. The stationary state is the classic state in mind. Is that clear to everybody, this way of thinking? Okay. This is actually the formulation from which the analysis of Schumpeter and many others starts. Because the observation here, which is logical observation, is, okay, imagine you are in a world like that. Have you ever been in a world like that? Literally, no. Right? Any world we live, even the one of the most traditional societies, something little changed. Okay? But in a world like that, if I can imagine as a thought experiment, there will be such a repetition. Things will be so identical. Notice that this world also requires a kind of demographic balance. Because if one year to another, from a decade to another, the demographic composition changes, even if the total number of people remain constant, if I have fewer children and more old people or vice versa, then given that they consume and produce differently, something will change also in the food. So I have to keep also demographic balance, which is why I think I mentioned to you in the models of von Neumann and other, you put people also in the list of things that get produced. I think I'm getting there are people produce themselves. They do produce themselves. Okay. Now the observation that Schumpeter made and many economists, which I think was relevant, is in a world like that, prices will become. Right? And you see the intuition of modern macroeconomics, which is what makes macroeconomics really retarded. Still, like the basic macroeconomic model. I'm sure you're curious people, especially if you take this class. You must be reading newspapers, serious newspapers, and so I could look at some documents. And you will notice that all these macroeconomic forecasts from these prestigious centers like IMF, central bank here, central bank there, when there is a recession, they always forecast a recovery. And when there is a quick recovery, they always forecast that it slows down. You notice? Always. There's no single exception. And you also have noticed that they're always wrong. Because the recession always comes when they don't forecast it. And the recovery also comes when they don't forecast it. And also the slowing down takes place. But that's another story. That has to do with why econometrics is a waste of time. That's not the topic of this class. As Prescott used to say, progress, do not regress. The point is why they always have this mean reversion. The point that they have a mean reversion is because they all start from a model like the one I have discussed, a model like a model in which stationary state is a station, and it's defined by a constancy in the production. Or we'll keep you. It's going to be an embarrassing video. I'm not going to put this online. Yawning too much, huh? Please. We have 30 minutes to go. Well, what is it? But maybe gets you. I don't know, maybe I ran out of yawns. There's a stock of yawns. Once we run out of yawns, stop yawning. If the prices are constant, then there's only one way of changing. It's this magic thing called the shock. Unfortunately, modern contemporary macroeconomics has been built in the 30s around that. Now, I don't want to blame the people of the 30s. I don't want to blame Robertson and Kahn and whatever, Slutsky and Frisch, Keynes. That's what they had. National income accounting was being invented. It was still quite rudimental. Not that now it's become rocket science, but it's a lot better than it used to be. Now we have microdata. Now we have a lot of stuff. Okay? So it's not unreasonable that they thought in that. They came from 200 years of research in which Petty and Turgot and Smith, they all had talked about station. They all had computed prices at steady state. They all had boiled down prices to cost and blah, blah, blah. They all had called them, talked about eventually this whole happy party will end, right? Fine. And there was a huge shock that seemed to end it for good. So it's very hard to blame the people in the 30s for having set up a macroeconomic. What we should blame, honestly, is the people in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to be so narrow-minded to have just taken that model, not tried to develop it and say, oh, it's good enough, let's play with it. Because once you take that and you want to try to do some econometrics, what is it you have to do? You have to decide that because in the data things move around, they're moving around because of shocks. Where shocks has to be interpreted as random noise, as in the statistical definition of random white noise. And so everything that perturbs the economy away from its stationary state is just extra economic. It's never due to economic causes, or it's never due to an interaction between economic, political, social causes that I can actually try to understand. Everything is a virus. Macroeconomics is plagued by viruses, usually small ones, more than COVID, smaller impact, but it's virus. Huh? Like, absolutely, it's a way of avoiding the question. Few lonely spirits among us have kept insisting, look, I understand it's difficult for Christ's sake, but we can't keep avoiding the issue, right? Some of the stuff is not virus. True, sometimes they're virus, I mean, it's just so one. But even this one has to look at the variety of GNP variation across even just European countries to realize that there is not just a shock. There are also choices that determine how much, right, you go up or down. Is that we've chosen that. Now, this is not a lecture, this is not either a class or a lecture on macro models, so I'm not going to go any much farther than this, but keep this in mind. That's why they have that. I will add a little bit, because I have a little bit of growth in a moment, but you already know where I'm going. But when all these models have this terrible limit, their stationary state models and their perturbation is just shock. And the only thing that they can do is to tell you how you go back to the stationary state. Because that's in fact the impulse response, right? That's in fact what the econometrician does. The econometrician literally, he has in the program, stationary state, position where you are, and an adjustment function. More or less complicated. It receives white noise as well, but if you start your displacement steady state, and you go back to steady. Who they? The Soviet Union. They did exactly the same thing, actually, from what I know. But you may know things that I don't know. Okay. But it's nothing to do with capitalism. The GMP, so for example, GMP computation has nothing to do with capitalism or socialism. Oh, don't worry. Yes, they do. They just call it in a different way. Material balances, but who cares? It's the same thing. So in the old days of the let's deviate to answer your friend the question. This I actually know. So in the old days in which they thought they were planning, they obviously had the plan. And the plan was the plan. It was literally a plan. I mean, the whole thing was so damn insane that these guys had a plan, which meant there was a guy, a bunch of guys, in an office that said, how many chairs do we need this year? 6,355,251. What is their price? Oh, socialist computation says that they are each chair is worth 2 t-shirts and 1 sock, not 2. Okay, what's the price of the sock? Then well, we boiled it down to the price of the new book of Lenin, and everything was expressed in Lenin books, and you know what's worth so many. I'm not actually kidding. Roughly, that was the nightmare that they would do, and that they would assign prices to the factories and say, "This is your budget constraint." That was the story of the soft budget for nine, blah blah blah. Go do things, and things would come up. But the idea, the Kantorovich, and the serious initiative, there was a period in which Russian economists contributed to the debate because you see, okay, we're going. Actually, I know that stuff because my advice, well, whatever, for a variety of personal reasons, I know that stuff. The history of economics, for those online, our friend here said in the socialist system, in particular in the Russian, the Chinese imitated for a while, but they didn't. The Chinese government never had time to enjoy it because, first of all, they produced famine and they killed 50 million people. Then they had to take care of Mao had to take care of the fact that 50 million people was a bit of a problem even for a big place like China, and so they wanted to kill him. And he said, "Well, one way of fucking you is I kill you before you kill me." And he said, "Well, let's do the Cultural Revolution." And then he finally died, son of a bitch. And that was an impression. We'll get to that. How good let's put it this way: the economic situation during the Cultural Revolution was not as terribly bad as during the famine of the 50s. Yeah, well, killing 50 million people in a couple of years is a record. If you keep doing it for a few years, even a large country like China, so you better stop. So yes, it's all relative. It's all relative. It's like it's all relative. And then there was a bit of turmoil. Things got a bit adjusted. Then shopping control. So there was never the Chinese experience planning the Soviet way only in the late 50s. Remember that Mao went to power in 49. The country was destroyed. Yes. But the Chinese situation was horrible. The country came out from invasion, civil war that started half a century before. Finally, more or less, things were unified under Mao in 49, but really not. The outer provinces were still having warlords. I mean, that's one thing that I never understood of my colleagues that run cross-country regression without checking what's going on in that country and treating every country as if it is some free market economy and using the same, like the famous growth regression of Barrow Salamatine. There are African countries that were in civil wars for decades, like China, and all kind of business. I mean, I want to do a growth regression: U.S., Canada, France, Italy, Germany, Japan. But what's the point of doing growth regression with Mozambique in the middle of a civil war that started 30 years ago, or Sudan, or Somalia, or Eritrea, right? I don't know what's the economics of war. There is an economics of war, but it can't be the solo growth point, right? So one has to be a bit careful in this cross country. But that's another topic. Forget this is lots of topics. Throw it away. Let's. So the point of why is that in Russia, in the Stalinist period, essentially, and then a little bit later, the Khrushchev period, there was a big development. It's because programming was really done with this huge input-output. Huge input-output. It's not by chance that Leonti was actually Russian. And yes, how else would you do a huge planning of an economy. Now, even if you plan the economy of your household, you have to use a multi-sector model. Potatoes, tomatoes. You like the oranges, your wife likes the apples. You know, you drink this coffee, she drinks another coffee. You like the red wine, she likes the white wine. You need a multi-sector model just to go shopping for a household of two. So if you have to plan an economy of a country that has 100 million people, the only thing you can do is to write gigantic vectors and try to put them in a computer. And therefore you use it. So they use activity. The thing I showed you 2 weeks ago. It was very much developed. Russia is very excellent mathematician. And so people did a lot of algebra and tried to figure out things. Okay? So the old planning was done with these huge linear production models with rectangular matrices of inputs and outputs. Okay? And so they contributed. And that was linked obviously to the economic debate about market socialism, planning, growth, how do we get? There was an idea, that the idea that was dominant was the following: we're gonna do a plan over a certain horizon, but then we're gonna adjust it every year or 2 or 3. So they had these quinquennial plans, right? And then if you look at the literature in the 50s and 60s, you will find a lot of mathematical research among economists on what we're called optimal rolling plans. A rolling plan is a plan that starts with an horizon, T periods, but you adjust your planning and targets every period as you receive information. But obviously, how do you do that? How do you receive information? That has to be a shock. Okay? So I plan to get there. I observe, I should have been over there next year. No, I'm a little bit on the left. What happened? Well, I got a shock. Then I tried to readjust, and I got a shock. This actually created a lot of very interesting literature, for example, for how to run a ship. David Gale, who was a very smart man, very good mathematician, contributed greatly to linear modes of production, had this beautiful thing. He says one of the reasons why you want to plan in the infinite horizon, even if you know you're a finite one in some sense, is because when you set your ship on the sea, you point at infinity at where you're going, right? And then you adjust continuously with the rolling plan as the waves and the winds move you around the main turnpike. So there is a literature, but sorry, not this class. Okay? It's part of the literature is still valid, I think. Part of it is definitely passé. So India, if you look again at the literature research, you will see there's a lot of contribution by India. Why? Because India tried after they reached independence. You do remember when India reached independence, right? When did Mahatma Gandhi got India independent from the United Kingdom? Check. Before World War II or after? Good, you got a good proxy. Yes, after. What does Google say? 1948 by any chance? 1949, but when they actually signed. I think it's 40. So India, right after tried, because India was politically they were semi-social. It was a very strange. If you look at the politics of India, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, also 80s, it's a strange animal. It's essentially a democratic country. There are elections, there are competing parties. First, they go through a big shock. Right? When India that gets independent, it's 1948, right? Yeah. That gets independent is a mixed country with a huge Muslim population. And let me do a bit of history. You may not know. They don't teach history of the world. Oh, why is there something called Pakistan? Why is there something called Bangladesh? Well, so it's actually important. The India that Queen Victoria ruled was very big, bigger than current, even if they did not have much control of parts of the south, and included today's Pakistan and Bangladesh. Okay? But there was always animosity between the Muslim population in India, in some sense the leftover of the Horde invasion, the Mongols, in some sense. Okay. And the Hindu. When the country reached independence, the tension became very strong between the two religions. And Gandhi decided, I don't know if it was a proper choice. Some historians say, look, the alternative to that was a gigantic massacre on both sides. It's very strange, essentially expelling or helping Muslim people from around India to move and break up the country in two parts, a Muslim part and a Hindu. The thing didn't work completely, but that's how Pakistan came out. And initially, Pakistan had two pieces because the Muslim enclaves were on the two north sides, one east, west Pakistan and one east Bangladesh. And then obviously after a while, the eastern part became independent country in 1996. And Pakistan became a state of the master. Very much. And then there is a minority of Pakistan, of Muslim people, but they go by the hundreds of millions. They still live in India. And as you know, continuous tension. That's why they're fighting in the Kashmir. Because since then, they never managed to agree peacefully on the border with the Kashmir. Very traditional, there are symbolic values. So they keep fighting over Kashmir. So that's, in any case, India tried some mild form of plan. So while they kept an electoral system that was democratic, what was the name of Nehru and Gandhi's party? No. A mildly socialist orientation, India decided to become, in fact, it was used to be called a neutral country between Russia and USSR and the United States, and they did a lot of planning. One disaster, they did. A lot of Indian economists. You find lots of Indian literature in the 50s and the 60s studying growth model, optimal planning, optimal control models of growth. That is the rolling plan. Something that people. All right, that's for the history. Now, what is the people did? They did this, what I wrote here. They said, there is growth, nevertheless. They said, oh yes, but it's different. The aggregate approach was the first bullet. There are two bullets point there, and then a third one that says, let me explain. So the aggregate growth theory, by far the most dominant one, was that they took their economy. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, they took this economy and they added TFP. Okay? TFP meant what? TFP meant the economy is like that. You see, that's the magic of simplification. It's a useful simplification, but you have to be careful. It's a simplification. So for a while, it works fine because I can keep saying I have this capital. It's just capital. I call it capital. And I aggregate, I express it in dollars. I don't have to list machines. I don't have a vector. I have just something, a number, capital. 365 billion of $1956 of capital stock. And then I have labor. I don't have to distinguish one type of labor from another. I just have 75 million people employed at so many hours each. Okay? And then I put them together and I have an output. Right? That's also another number. But I notice, obviously, that the thing I mentioned, that capital, as I measure it, and labor, as I measure it, don't grow nearly as fast as output grows. And there is this component that is the fact that, in fact, capital and labor are changing. There is technological change. But if it is, and if the number you're looking at is this, and in fact, I made a mistake here. I should have put aggregate, because if I do it for the aggregate, it's a lot more stable. Let me actually see if I can. All right, you see, if I am sitting here or here, one of those guys doing growth model at the end of that in the 60s or early 70s, and I look at this, it is very stable. Oops, why doesn't it show? It says interval. Sorry, what's supposed? Stupid machine. Why does it do this? Right. Now I skip showing the consumption. All right. Now we have it. Right. So you see, if I'm here and I'm looking at this thing, man, this is a very stable thing. It becomes spontaneous, saying it's growing at a constant rate and there are some shocks that move it around. It's a ship going through the oceans, more or less straight line, but every few hours there's some big wind wave, or every 2 days, and we move a bit off, but then we go back. So you regress, right? So what you do, you multiply the production function by, what does it show now? Show my slides. Yeah. You multiply this stuff by some forcing factor that grows at 2%. And then you divide everything by something that is X, 2% T, that T is unit of time, right? And everything is stationary. You can just study a stationary set of data. And in your data, you detrend them. You always take away the growth rate. Right? So you have balanced growth again. So now you have a model of growth where there is some growth, but the growth is not even an issue. It's some stuff that blows up the machine at 2%. That's it. Not very interesting. It's the same damn balloons, just grows up at 2%. Its composition is always the same. And therefore, any shock has to revert you back to the station. Macroeconomics model used everywhere in the world, even today, 70 years later, I like that. Irma Adelman and her husband, when they set up the first kind of model of this type in Berkeley, in the early 60s, I was visible. They were the 4 equation and they increased it a bit. It was literally the first time. So that was the model. It's more impressive that 65 years later, people are still doing exactly the same thing. They have G160 equation and a lot of more sophisticated things to adjust the shocks, but the logic is okay. Now, then there is a theoretical debate. There was people involved with a bit of research for a while, which was all kind of technological progress gives this nice thing that I can multiply y and c and I by this exponential that grows at 2%. And get the nice result. The answer was no, you have to be neutral. for labor saving, probably in some macro course they taught you about. Honestly, it's not very interesting. Why? It's just mathematics. Simple mathematics to create a tool that fits the aggregate production function. That's all the doing. So you see all this, there's a gigantic debate in the second part of the 60s, in particular early 70s, about the nature of technological change. The people debate if it is hard neutral, fixed neutral, labor saving, labor capital saving, and so on. And what is the problem? The problem is if I have a production function, y like the one I equal f k, and I have a station, where can I put x multiplicative element that grows at some percentage rule in that production function so that I can eliminate it and reduce everything to state calculation? That's pretty much the debate. It's a bit of a silly debate, I have to say. Lots of colleagues or friends will get offended, including some dear friends that contributed to it. So as a mathematical problem, it's interesting to work out the various types of technological products, meaning the various types of representation of this autonomous function that preserve properties. But that's all. You're not learning anything about the algorithm. You're learning about, is it capital augmenting or labor augmenting? For example, they discovered that if it multiplies capital, meaning that what technological progress does is to, if you have a constant number of workers, right? Technological progress is as if the workers grow at 2% a year. So instead of having labor tomorrow is labor today, multiply 1.02. The number of workers are the same, but they are 2% more productive. Okay, so you represent it like that. Good. That captures the data. Because the one thing you notice in the data is that the form of productivity that technological progress is bringing about is reflected in an increased labor productivity, measured labor productivity, more than an increase capital productivity. The measure of capital productivity doesn't come out as much. So it's, it's labor augmented technology. Or, which is equivalent, if your production function is called Douglas, it's equivalent of just multiplying the production function by this fact. In fact, your typical production function of Douglas when people do growth is written like A times T multiply K times T at the power alpha multiply L the times T at the 1 minus alpha or beta. AT is this forcing term that the multiplicative or neutral technological progress that just takes the isoquant and shifts it up at 2%. It does capture those data. Point is, it doesn't explain those data. It has the same property of a polynomial. I give you n points, you will always find a polynomial that can go through them if you take the polynomial of a high enough degree. That does not explain. And so the whole research for a while goes on. The alternative is this, but this also is not very interesting. One way of capturing that was to write down a model. I call it von Neumann because von Neumann is objectively the first guy who started it out, which is like this in the vector version. The one I mentioned, the one in which y is not just a number, it's just a long. Now, think about it. Imagine a world in which you have all these different goods, okay? And each one of them has a production function. And imagine the production function is very simple. It says that you produce bananas, okay? By means of banana tomorrow, by means of bananas today, multiply a certain coefficient B, okay? plus labor. Okay. Is that possible to have bananas growing forever? Yes, it's possible. As long as B is larger than 1, right? 1 banana today gives me more than 1 banana tomorrow, and then 1 more, it goes up, linear. So another way of having this model that is stationary and has kind of constant growth, stable growth, is to write down a big linear model. This was clear for Neumann. He wrote it in the 1930s. Obviously, people that studied growth theory at the time didn't think that that was so insightful because they were very interested. The theorists of economic growth that follow from us were all Schumpeterian. And all had understood that to understand growth per se, you had to understand technological change. Okay? And so they said, well, you know, the fact that B is larger than 1, that from 1 banana I get 1.2 bananas, then I get 1.2, so it's 1.44, and then another 1.2. Sure, it doesn't seem to be like that, right? They don't keep producing the same goods, accumulate. So people said, okay, fine, that's one way to go. They gave it a name. They studied it. They called it the phenomenon per pi, the phenomenon facet. They looked at it for a while. It was very abstract mathematical stuff that didn't become very well known, but then they excluded it. In fact, if you read the very famous paper, and I conclude for today, by Solo, so we'll start from there next week, because it has to do with this last thing here. You remember Solo 1956? Can you please make an effort to read it? At least the people here in class seem to be. It's not so difficult. We'll talk about why, because there is. I ask you to discover a footnote. There is a footnote in that, in which Solo says what I just said with different words. It says, I could have blah 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 growth forever, but I'm not interested. I want to study the stationary state. So I don't consider. And it's in a footnote, and the paper was published in 1956, which means if he put it in a footnote, it means the people he was talking to knew that thing, they knew it was obvious, and they said, yeah, that's not so interesting. Put it in a footnote, just to explain the reader, I'm not considering that case. I don't want to study that case, because that case is understood, okay? And so that was very well understood and stayed there. And then it got forgotten. So next class, I will try to explain that this created a very interesting half a century after. The people knew that there was a way of doing growth, but it was not a very interesting way of doing growth because there was no technological change. It was just the fact that bananas, 1 banana produced 2, 2 produced 4, 4 produced 8. Yeah, very nice, but that's a good economic theory of rabbits. You know, rabbits work like that, but GNP doesn't seem to be different from rabbits. And that remains suspended. People never addressed it. That's what happened. It was this way to go. I call it the phenomenon, or this, the TFP, balanced growth. And people went the TFP way. And went the TFP way all the way for 30 years plus. And at a certain point, anybody talking about growth was not talking about growth. So nothing in this graph, obviously, this part was understandable, but everything, all this oscillation, this change of speed, and these was not understandable, right? How do you understand these with balance growth? Anyway, OTFP in China, first is nothing, then it was at 3%, then it was at 7, then it was at 12, then it was, okay. God keeps explaining everything, right? You don't understand. So that's what at certain point in the late 80s, early 90s, people said, oof, you know, clearly we have a theory that is not a theory, it's a theory of nothing. That created the debate that is still going on. Okay. All right, let me stop here for today. So please send me those emails that so we decide where we go drink and we decide when we have the makeup class. Thank you. Take care. Good night.